June 15, 1944. The Norman bocage, 3 miles south of Villers-Bocage. A Panzer officer peers through his periscope at the narrow lane ahead, hedgerows pressing in on both sides. His Tiger tank has just destroyed 3 British Cromwells in as many minutes. The crew is confident, almost relaxed. Then, from somewhere in the dense vegetation to their left, comes a sound. Not the crack of a conventional anti-tank gun. Something else. A whooshing roar like fabric tearing at tremendous speed. The Tiger's commander has perhaps 2 seconds to process this before a shaped charge warhead strikes his tank's side armor at 140 meters per second. The explosion doesn't bounce off. It doesn't ricochet. It punches clean through 80 millimeters of steel plate and fills the fighting compartment with superheated metal fragments traveling at 8,000 meters per second. The Tiger is dead. Its crew, if they survive the initial blast, abandon it within seconds. What killed them wasn't fired from another tank. It wasn't even fired from a gun in the traditional sense. It was launched from a tube carried by 2 men hiding in a hedgerow. A weapon so simple a child could understand its mechanism, yet so devastatingly effective it would force German armored doctrine to fundamentally change. This is the story of the PIAT, the projector infantry anti-tank, the shoulder-fired weapon that gave British infantry the power to destroy the most heavily armored vehicles ever built. By 1942, the problem facing British infantry was brutally simple and seemingly insoluble. German Panzer divisions were fielding tanks with frontal armor exceeding 100 millimeters in thickness. The Panzer IV, the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, carried 80 millimeters of face-hardened steel on its glacis plate. The Tiger, already appearing in Tunisia, boasted 120 millimeters at the front. British infantry anti-tank rifles, the Boys 55 caliber rifles they'd carried since 1937, could barely scratch paint at anything beyond point-blank range. At 100 meters, a Boys rifle could penetrate perhaps 13 millimeters of armor plate. 13 millimeters against 80. The mathematics were obscene. Soldiers knew it. They'd seen what happened when you tried to stop a Panzer advance with Boys rifles. You died, usually slowly, as the tank methodically ground your position into the earth. The standard response was to call for artillery or anti-tank guns, but artillery took time to range, and anti-tank guns were heavy, crew-served weapons that couldn't follow infantry into close country. In the rubble of Stalingrad, in the wadis of North Africa, in the bocage of Normandy, British soldiers needed something they could carry, something they could use from cover, something that would actually kill a tank. Every army was searching for the same solution. The Germans had their Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck programs underway. The Americans were developing the bazooka. But in 1942, nothing existed in British hands that truly solved the problem. The British solution would emerge from an unlikely source, a rejected grenade launcher design and the stubborn genius of a man who refused to accept that shaped charges couldn't be made to work. The weapon that would eventually terrify panzer crews began its life at the Ministry of Supply's research facility at Whitechurch, just outside Cardiff. Major Millis Jeffries, already responsible for several unconventional weapons, including the sticky bomb, had been examining a rejected spigot mortar design originally intended for launching grenades. The principle was simple. A steel rod would be driven forward by a powerful spring, striking a propellant charge in the tail of the projectile. The explosion would simultaneously launch the projectile and recock the spring. It was mechanically elegant, but had been dismissed for grenade work as too complex. Jeffries saw something else. He saw a platform for a shaped charge warhead.
the same Monroe effect technology that allowed a relatively small explosive to defeat thick armor by focusing its energy into a superheated jet of metal. The challenge was making it work at short range. Shaped charges needed distance to function properly, typically 15 to 20 times the diameter of the charge. Fire too close, and the jet doesn't form correctly. But infantry anti-tank weapons had to work at short range, often under 50 meters. Jeffries and his team solved this by creating a warhead with an extended probe at its tip. The probe would strike the target first, initiating the shaped charge detonation at the optimal distance from the armor surface. The result was a 3-pound warhead, 3 inches in diameter, capable of penetrating approximately 100 millimeters of armor plate, roughly equivalent to the protection on a Tiger tank's side armor. The complete weapon weighed 32 pounds, stretched 40 inches from buttstock to barrel end, and looked, in the words of one soldier, like a drain pipe that had mated with a rifle. The spring mechanism generated a peak force of 200 pounds. Loading required placing the weapon butt down, standing on the shoulder rest, and pulling the barrel upward until the spring locked into battery position. It required the strength of a full-grown man and left users red-faced and trembling. Production began at Imperial Chemical Industries facilities in Birmingham in late 1942. By mid-1943, roughly 115,000 PIATs had been manufactured. The exact total remains classified in some documentation, but post-war assessments suggest somewhere between 100 and 115,000 units reached British and Commonwealth forces before production ceased in 1945. The PIAT entered combat in Tunisia in early 1943, though accounts from this period are fragmentary. What's documented is that it proved effective against Italian armor almost immediately. The real test came in Italy proper, in the rubble of Ortona and the mountains beyond Cassino. Here, in close urban combat, the PIAT found its natural environment. German tanks couldn't maneuver easily in narrow streets. British infantry positioned in upper-story windows or concealed in rubble could fire down onto thinner top armor or strike side plates at point-blank range. One account from Ortona describes a PIAT team destroying a Panzer IV by firing through a ground-floor window as the tank passed. The bomb struck the turret ring, detonating the ammunition inside. The explosion was so violent it blew the turret 15 feet from the hall. But it was in Normandy, in that impossible landscape of sunken lanes and towering hedge, that the PIAT truly proved its worth. Visibility was measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. Tanks had to advance slowly, confined to narrow tracks. Infantry could set up PIAT positions in hedgerows overlooking these choke points, completely invisible until they fired. The psychological effect on German armored crews was profound. They had been trained to fear anti-tank guns, weapons that announced their presence with a sharp crack and a visible muzzle flash. The PIAT made a strange whooshing sound, more like a heavy object being thrown than a gun being fired. By the time you heard it, the bomb was already in flight. And because PIAT teams fired from concealment, often from above, locating them was nearly impossible. Records from German units in Normandy, fragmentary as they are, mention increasing reluctance to advance through bocage without extensive infantry support, specifically citing fear of short-range projectile weapons.
If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It allows us to keep researching and producing these detailed examinations of forgotten technologies. The Germans had attempted their own anti-tank solutions, and comparing them to the PIAT reveals the British weapon's particular strengths and weaknesses. The Panzerfaust, entering service in late 1943, was lighter, simpler, and genuinely disposable. A soldier could carry multiple Panzerfausts where he could barely manage one PIAT.
The Panzerfaust's shaped charge was also more powerful, capable of defeating 200 millimeters of armor. But the Panzerfaust was truly single-use. Once fired, the tube was discarded. The PIAT could fire again and again, limited only by the availability of bombs and the operator's physical stamina. The German Panzer, a direct copy of the American bazooka, offered similar reusability, but required 2 men to operate effectively and produced a massive backblast signature that revealed the firing position instantly. The PIAT's spring mechanism generated almost no visible signature. A well-concealed PIAT team could fire, observe the hit, and remain completely hidden. The American bazooka, in its early M1 and M1A1 variants, was lighter than the PIAT and easier to operate, but its 2.36-inch rocket couldn't reliably penetrate the frontal armor of German heavy tanks. American forces compensated with superior numbers and combined arms coordination, but in close terrain where infantry fought alone, the PIAT's stopping power was unmatched. Soviet forces, interestingly, examined captured PIATs, but opted to focus on their own RPG series, which wouldn't enter service until after the war. They relied instead on massed anti-tank rifles and an almost suicidal willingness to attack tanks with magnetic mines. The PIAT represented a middle path, reusable, powerful, and concealable, but demanding enormous physical effort and courage from its operators. The weapon's impact on the war is difficult to quantify with precision because tank losses were rarely attributed to specific weapon types in after-action reports. What can be said with confidence is the German tactical doctrine changed in response to weapons like the PIAT. Armored advances through close terrain without infantry support became increasingly rare after 1943. Tanks began standing off, using their guns to suppress suspected anti-tank positions before closing. This slowed advances, disrupted timetables, and gave defending forces time to organize counterattacks. The psychological impact may have been greater than the material one. A PIAT bomb didn't always destroy a tank outright. Sometimes it damaged the tracks or suspension. Sometimes it merely terrified the crew into abandoning an otherwise functional vehicle. Records are sparse, but post-war interviews with German tank crews reveal a common thread. The fear of unseen infantry weapons in close terrain exceeded, in many cases, the fear of conventional anti-tank guns. The PIAT contributed to this fear. It made every hedgerow, every ruined building, every pile of rubble a potential threat. And unlike a mine, which was passive, the PIAT was actively aimed. Someone was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This knowledge, this constant awareness of invisible danger, wore down crews in ways that can't be measured in statistics. The weapon's technical innovations influenced post-war development significantly. The shaped charge principle, refined in the PIAT, informed the design of later recoilless rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. The emphasis on man portability and individual firepower became central to infantry anti-tank doctrine. Surviving PIATs can be seen today at the Imperial War Museum in London, the Tank Museum at Bovington, and the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. They sit behind glass, silent and inert, looking more awkward than threatening. It's difficult, seeing them now, to imagine the terror they once inspired. June 15, 1944, the Normandy bocage, 3 miles south of Villers-Bocage. A Tiger tank burns, its crew scattered into the hedge, shaken and disbelieving. 2 British infantrymen, their PIAT already reloaded, watch from concealment 70 meters away. They don't move, they barely breathe. Further down the lane, they can hear another tank's engine, its commander likely on the radio, calling for instructions, asking what happened, whether to advance or withdraw. The answer, when it comes, is withdrawal. Not because of artillery, not because of air support, because of 2 men with a drainpipe weapon weighing 32 pounds. In the calculus of armored warfare, this shouldn't be possible. Tanks are supposed to dominate infantry in open ground, and even in close terrain, their armor should provide security. But the PIAT changed that calculation. It gave individual soldiers the power to kill a 50-ton machine. It made every advance a gamble, every narrow lane a potential death trap. The weapon wasn't elegant. It wasn't comfortable to use. It demanded brute strength to load and ice-cold nerves to fire effectively. But it worked. In the rubble of Ortona, in the bocage of Normandy, in the streets of German cities in 1945, it worked. German Panzer divisions, the most powerful armored formations ever assembled, learned to retreat from positions they could have taken, not because they lacked the firepower or the armor, because somewhere in that terrain, invisible and impatient, was a man with a PIAT, and that was enough.